I'm going to invite up a student. His name is Michael Jupiter, and he's going to ask you your second question tonight. Mike.
Good afternoon. My question is, how would you support the re-enfranchisement of individuals with felony convictions?
Oh, yes, the same words. Mr. Howard.
If I understood the question, it was how would I support the re-enfranchisement of convicted felons? Well, that really leads to an important aspect of my campaign that I really want to talk about. It's fundamental to the Constitution. Article 3, Section 1 is the division of powers, which says that basically anyone who's composed of or belongs to one branch can't basically overstep their constitutional authority to make anything happen in any of the other branches. So as I understand, you're asking what would a question which would require legislation, and there's a lot of those questions surrounding the elections issue. You'll hear the term bully pulpit thrown around. It's not a term that I like to use. Obviously, bullying's not a very popular thing to do in the 21st century, and it's kind of inconsistent with our constitutional boundaries. But as Steve and Dan will talk about, we all want all Minnesotans who have, served their time, whether it's living here 18 years and meeting their residency requirement. I know for myself that people who have entered the justice system and then have been trying to reintegrate to society, absolutely I support them having a path to re-enfranchisement. I think that's a great word. I think it's something that we need to not expect our Secretary of State to push a button and make happen. We need to understand this issue, understand how it affects people that have gone into the criminal justice system and left, how it's continues to be a penalty against whatever crime they may have committed. So we need to have an honest discussion about it as Minnesotans. We need to make sure our representatives and senators, the elected legislative branch, understand the issue and represent what the majority of opinion of Minnesotans would be. May I ask the audience a question of where they stand on re-enfranchisement?
I believe that's okay, as long as it's within your 2 minutes.
So, I mean, if we have a consensus in this room, we should be able to take this back to our legislators and get this type of legislation passed. So, may I ask in this room, by show of hands, who supports re-enfranchisement of convicted felons? All right. I've made my case that it's not something I would be able to do, Secretary of State. Obviously, I want people who work hard, who redress whatever past crimes they might have done. There's got to be a path to redemption, and it's got to involve, I believe, as my own personal philosophy, a path to participating in political and government systems. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Helen. Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you. And kind of along that context is the Secretary of State, and as I talked about in my opening remarks, is a guardian of the Constitution. And because of that, it's not partisan. And because of that, has to have a very clear understanding of where the delineation of powers go. Just as Bob was talking about a little bit in Article 7, Section 1, it says, it gives a criteria for eligibility. You have to be 18 years of age, you have to have been a citizen at least 3 months prior to the election, citizen of the United States, and you have to have lived within in the state for 30 days, and then it goes into the criteria that says you have to be of sound mind, you cannot be a convicted felon, serving out the felony conviction, whose civil rights have not been restored. So if that is written in the Constitution, it's the Secretary of State's responsibility to ensure that the eligibility requirements are met for all those individuals that are going to the polls. Now, in 2008, as an issue, there were 1,009 felons that voted. Was it their fault? Well, probably not. If the challenge was put on the state voter registration system so that when that felon went up to the poll to vote, there was a challenge that was given to him and said, you know that under federal or under law, it's a felony if you vote. They're not going to vote. But if the Secretary of State is delinquent in his responsibility to make sure that that role is updated. Now it becomes an issue, and now 1,009 felons voted, which by the course of action had a definite influence on the 312 votes that got Senator Franken elected. So the reason I bring that to this issue is it is so important for that office to do their job in terms of constitutionality, ensuring that all of those guidelines are met. It's not, what feels good. Now, if we want to change that, as this gentleman has suggested, there is a venue to do that. It's called the Constitutional Amendment. The people of Minnesota, and if there are a majority of the people of Minnesota who raise their hands in this room and say, you know what, we think that ought to be repealed, that as soon as they get out of jail, they should have their rights restored, then that is the people speaking through the proper channels of a constitutional amendment. That would be the responsibility of the legislature. And as a Secretary of State, I would honor that, sign it into law, and ensure that that's enacted so that as soon as we know that gentleman stepped out of the prison, that his or lady has the ability to vote once more. But again, I need data in order to do that. The job of the Secretary of State is to uphold the law and the Constitution. And so I think that venue is it's an admirable. I know that people want to see people re-enfranchised into the culture, into the system. Sometimes I feel like that is an important part. The voting is an important part of feeling that franchise, and I get that. But again, our founders put something in the ground, or, put an anchor there for us to hold on to. And so we have a venue in which we can change that, and we are a law-abiding country, and that is the process that would be necessary to be used. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Mr. Simon, you may proceed.
Well, thanks for the question. It's a great question and a very timely one. Our U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder in the Obama administration last spring, I think quite eloquently talked about this issue and the needs for state to move in the direction of re-enfranchising more, if not all, certainly more people who have been convicted of a felony. Just by way of background, and I find this personally fascinating, there are basically four, and some of you may already know this, but there are basically four kind of groups, you might say, among the states about how they treat people who are convicted of felonies. One group, let's say over on one end of the line or continuum, there are only two states, Maine and Vermont, who say that even if you are in prison and serving time for a felony, no matter what the felony is, you can still vote. You never lose your right to vote. That's Maine and Vermont. Then the second grouping is about 12 or 14 states, including North Dakota, which say that here's the rule. When you're in prison, convicted of a felony, you can't vote. But the minute you step outside, you can, even if you're still serving the rest of your sentence on paper, as it's called. So your whole felony sentence is done, but the prison part of that felony sentence is done. So it's a bright line rule. In prison, no. The minute you step out, even if you're still serving part of that sentence, the minute you step out, you can. Minnesota is in the majority of states. I think it's roughly 32 or so states right now, which say you get your right to vote back once your whole felony sentence is done, the prison part and the on-paper part. And then there's a few states, mostly in the Deep South, that either actually or practically say that with respect to some felons or felonies, you lose your right to vote basically forever. And so there's a movement to move Minnesota from the camp that it's in now to more of the North Dakota model. A bright line rule saying if you're in prison, you can't, but if you're out of prison, you can. I gotta tell you, one of the tricks in answering this question is that in Minnesota, we have something sort of uncommon. Governor Dayton has said, both as a candidate and many times as governor, that the only way he's ever gonna sign elections-related bills into law is if they have what he calls broad bipartisan support. So it can't just be token support, it's gotta be actual and real bipartisan support. Now, there are only Democrats and Republicans in the legislature. There aren't any independents or libertarians right now. So that's why he says bipartisan, I suspect. What that means is it's not going to get done if Democrats want it done only, and it's not going to get done if only Republicans want it done. So from my vantage point, as chair of the House Elections Committee and someone who's been very involved in these issues for a long time, I think Minnesota will inevitably move in that direction. And it may not be a re-enfranchisement of 100% all at once of everyone, but I think there is an understanding, generally, that is the way that Minnesota is going to be going because people in this room and elsewhere are calling out for it. The idea is that, look, there are other rights that are withheld from people who are on a felony sentence. But those rights typically have to do directly with public safety. those rights are curtailed. Here, voting doesn't have anything to do with public safety. Nobody is threatened or harmed or hurt by the person across the street who is voting. And so I think that will inform the thinking in Minnesota as we go forward, and I think that's an important thing. By the way, just because I have a minute left, on the topic of those convicted of a felony, I have to say there's one easy and simple and relatively low-cost way that we could solve so much of the problem in Minnesota when it comes to those convicted of a felony who inadvertently, mistakenly vote and then get in trouble. Vote because maybe they're confused as to what their rights are. And that is by simply appropriating some money, not a lot of money. We tried this in the legislature but couldn't get the bipartisan support. Some money to make sure we send mailings and do phone calls and otherwise tell people what their rights to vote are. You know, there are two species. There are the people who think they can vote and can't, and the more heartbreaking part is the people who can vote, who have been off paper for years and are under the false impression that they can't vote and haven't been voting in some cases for decades. That's wrong, and that has to be corrected.
Thank you, Mr. Simon.